Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Humanizing Race as we're doing some interviews with people that I know, people I love and trust about the issues of God, race, and America. And today I have the privilege of talking to my friend, Rabbi Daniel Bogart. Daniel and I connected, I don't know what, maybe 7, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, something like that in Peoria, Illinois, and hit it off immediately. And, my life is richer and better because of my friendship with Daniel. And we are have a lot of different views on a lot of different things, religiously, politically, and yet we have a great friendship, a great respect. We challenge each other in our thinking. And, I wish that more people that had disagreements could be able to get along like you and I do, Daniel.
I totally agree. I was just thinking about that the other day, a panel I was on, and thinking we disagree so well, the two of us. Yeah.
Yeah. But you got to be challenged sometimes. You got to think, and it's that process, that tension sometimes is necessary to be able to have growth. And like I said, my life is richer because of you. And thank you for taking the time today.
Right back at you. Right
Daniel's married his lovely wife Karen. They've been married 12 years. She's also a rabbi, and she's very, very sharp and serving there at their synagogue there in St. Louis area. And they have three wonderful kids. Daniel, I really appreciate you talking to us today. And how you guys been doing?
We're pandemic well, as we're getting used to saying, right? We feel really lucky and really fortunate, and I'm convinced no one's really okay, right? Like,
yeah, right. So much. What was it in the 70s? There was a book, "I'm Okay, You're Okay," or something like that. So, boy, that thing wouldn't sell a copy now, would it?
Exactly.
Yeah. So first of all, Daniel, in the midst of this, with the pandemic, everything happening with the racial tensions and the discussions taking place, where are you encouraged right now? Where do you find hope inside of your soul?
I have trouble with hope sometimes these days. I know we talked about this on the phone before, but for the last two High Holy Days, so we're about to have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Sort of imagine in terms of a pastor, like if you had Easter and Christmas 10 days apart from each other, in terms of the insanity of it all, right? But for the last 2 or 3 years, for my big sermon, I give one big sermon every year during the holidays. Decided going in that I was going to write it about hope. And for 3 years running now, I have written a sermon about hope that ends up being so dark that I have trashed it within days of Yom Kippur and started it again. So I don't know that that's a very hopeful answer. So let me maybe look. I find hope by the fact that folks like you are having conversations like this. I look out at the world and in our country that it feels at moments like it's tearing itself apart. But I also feel like we're having conversations that we've needed to have for a long time. And so these conversations are tough, just like they're tough when you have these tough, hidden away, long conversations with your family members. They're tough when we have them as a country, but I get hope from it. I get hope from the protests and the folks on the streets and folks like you. And,
As you talk about that, what concerns you? Where are you lamenting? Where are you grieving? Where are you really concerned right now in the midst of all this?
I certainly am hurting the most these days for my Black and brown friends and Americans in this world. But I don't know. I guess in a more broad sense, it feels like we have entered into a moment that's new in my lifetime, where license has been given for folks to just say awful things to each other and to say awful things in public. And I know some of this is about our politics and these things. I also think some of it is about the anonymity of online and sort of the disconnect that we're used to at some level. But, look, in the last, 3, 4, 5 years, I went from being a rabbi who gave sermons about how there basically isn't anti-Semitism in America and how American Jews needed to stop beating on the anti-Semitism drum as a way of getting Jews to be more Jewish and so on and so forth, to being someone who I don't have a week that goes by without directly experiencing anti-Semitism today. And, the two of us, Jim, we had this documentary we were a part of, no joke. And even 6 months after we recorded it, this was back in 2015, I think we recorded. Um, Even a few months later, watching it, I said to them, like, this is out of date when it comes to how I think about anti-Semitism. That's how radically this has changed in America these last few years.
Now, Daniel, I remember because I was going, walking with you in friendship through this process as you saw this change, and we were very fortunate to be invited to the National Prayer Breakfast in 2016, I believe it was, or 17, and and I remember you left, you took a train to go see some family or friends or someone there in the DC area. And I remember you texting or calling and saying, you won't believe it. And just share the story about some guy just started randomly yelling at you on this transporting, minding your own business. Share the story.
Yeah. Continues to give me kind of a chill down my spine. So I have for more than a decade now, I don't know, 15 years now, whatever it is, walked around in the United States wearing a kippah full time, or almost full time, which means that almost everywhere I go, people publicly can tell that I am Jewish. And I get asked about it pretty regularly. And yet for all of that, for the first, I don't know, 5-6 years of doing this, 7 years, I never had a moment, like never. Every once in a while, someone would give you a funny look or something like that. But so I was on this train. We'd left the prayer breakfast and I was going to spend Shabbat, the Sabbath, with a dear friend. And I don't know, I was 2 steps in and playing on my phone. I actually remember that there was no internet, that we had gone through a tunnel or something. And I was sitting there bored because I couldn't check the news. And this guy sits down directly across from me and turns to me and stares in my face and says, "This country is not yours and this world is not yours. And you and your people need to go back where you came from." And I didn't even know what to do or what to say or how to react. And it was one of those moments. I mean, there were other people in this car and this was this person was not being shy. And no one said anything. Everyone just stared ever more intently into their phones. And at the next stop, which was not my stop, I mean, many stops away from my stop, I got off and was terrified. And that was that moment.
And so that was, a couple years ago, and you say that the Jewish communities, and I've read someplace, I remember your school you went through in Cincinnati was vandalized. I mean, a lot of things like that have been happening in increasing measure the last few years. There's been a real uptick in anti-Semitism. And then, you said that some things you've been experiencing there in St. Louis of late, even with Zoom and online stuff. Share about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it when I say that a week doesn't go by anymore without experiencing direct anti-Semitism, where we will have neo-Nazis try to crash our Zoom meetings repeatedly over and over and over again. They try, where they break in, they start saying Hail Hitler if someone accidentally lets them in. They start drawing swastikas. It just awfulness, and it doesn't stop. I mean, it's constant. And of course, what it means, just as it does in the real world, but in this online world, is that we have to put up ever more barriers that make it harder and harder for folks who want to come in to get in as well. Right? It was already hard enough for a 75-year-old to make their way into Zoom if they're not familiar with computers and so on and so forth. And now we're setting up passwords in waiting rooms, and but that happens multiple times a week. Routinely, I get people who send me messages like, "Your time is up, Yudin," or "I guess you're lucky and we won't have to kill all of you this time." Or I mean, it's endless. I put something on Facebook the other day, not because it was particularly present, but because I realized I don't think a lot of people realize just how much of my reality this is. It's happens almost every day.
Oh, that's so sad. And you said that you feel like over the last couple of years that the people that are on the fringes, the edges, that they're even more and more emboldened. You said that people are not even hiding their faces or their identities. They're just spewing this stuff to you. And
that I think continues to be what disturbs me the most about these sort of folks who join, the white supremacists who join neo-Nazi. I don't know what you call it. If they say Hail Hitler, I guess they're neo-Nazis. But that they don't hide their faces when they join these Zoom meetings. They're not in clan hoods, right? These are people who you can see their face like I can see your face. They're not ashamed.
A lot of, now of course you're Jewish, and a lot of this conversation is precipitated because of what's happening with the African American community and the conversations and what's been brought to the forefront there. But a lot of white people, I feel like we look back at the 1960s, 50s, we look at the 1800s, and we say, well, it's better than it was, and we really don't have that much of a problem. And part of the reason I'm doing these interviews is I'm trying to help people to see that there is still a bigger problem than we think. And, I said when I was doing my last interview with Jahan, I said, we look back in the 60s and it's very evident the problems that were in place there in the 60s. But at the time, over half of Americans were opposed. They didn't think there was a problem. They were opposed that. I mean, Richard Nixon was close personal friends with Jackie Robinson, and he removed himself before the election because he felt if he was too close to Jackie Robinson, it could affect his chances of election because so many people were in denial about the problems. And I think my concern is that I think even today in 2020, things are better than they were in many ways, but there's still a lot of problems, and I think a lot of us are blind to them.
I totally agree. A lot of Americans think of Jews as white people. And that's because about 80% of American Jews are white Jews. But 20%, 1 in 5 American Jews are Jews of color. A majority of Israelis, by the way, are Jews of color. But American Jews for generations we refer to America. My grandparents called it as the Goldene Medina, which is like Yiddish, but you can even understand it not knowing any of it, right? Like it was the Golden Land, the place where the streets were paved with, I always think of cheese, right? There was that Steven Spielberg mouse movie, right? That's the Jewish story though. That Steven Spielberg mouse movie is the Jewish story of America that we told ourselves. And it was the place of success, and it's been a great, amazing place of success for Jews. But the thing of it is if this 80% of American Jews who are white, when we ask the 20% of American Jews who are Jews of color, their story of America is really different, and their experience of America is really different. And, it's a reminder that, at least for me, the stories that I grew up with about America being the Goldene Medina were deeply connected to my being accepted as white in this country in a way that I think I'm only beginning to reckon with.
And so as we talk about, Daniel, obviously the stories of overt racism, like what you, kid, people yelling at you, whatever, that what happened in the train, those stories people say, oh, that's clearly racist. But I think that the thing that is hard for us to understand is that there's still a lot of these more subtle forms of racism. And so you're saying that 20% of American Jews that are people of color, that their experience is those, whether it's overt things, but not just the overt things, because we can easily identify those, the subtle elements of racism and prejudice that they experience is much different and more profound than yours as a white Jew, correct?
So my Jewish community, I feel very fortunate, Central Reformed Congregation in St. Louis, we overrepresent in terms of the number of Jews of color who are a part of our community and really a core part of our community. And it was really it was so clear after the Pittsburgh shooting when for whatever percentage of our community, we immediately needed to have a cop at every door, and we needed to have a cop at Hebrew school, and we needed to have a cop at all of these things. For so many Jews of color, having a police officer at the door meant that they felt less welcome there. It meant that they felt scared, that this was an encounter. And I can tell you, after having experienced it, I see it. I see the Jews of color are treated differently when they come to the doors of my own synagogue now that we have security, now that there's a police officer there, and we work on it, and we're constantly working on this. But these things are seen so differently, and the experiences are so different when you stop centering it on the white experience.
And the thing about is, one of the things that I say about, the New Testament is when you read the story of Jesus and, his interactions with the Pharisees. And I know you studied the New Testament a little bit when you were in your seminary, but, the counters that we read in the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, about Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees, is that Jesus was constantly calling them out about things that they were blind to. And one of the things I say is that they were blind to their blindness. They weren't just blind to the fact they didn't see certain things. They didn't even think they had a problem that they were blind to. And I think that that's part of what concerns me, is that when you are in the majority, sometimes you don't see what you don't see. But I do think the fact that when we're not willing to listen, that there might be issues there that we're missing, that's where we really get in trouble, because now we're being blind to our blindness, or we're not even acknowledging the potential that we're blind to certain things. But when I talk to people of color, they're just continually telling me they've all got their stories of both overt and more subtle things that they face on a regular basis.
Yeah. It's funny you said that. I have a shofar right here. It's right now we're in the month of Elul in the Jewish calendar. It's the month that leads up to Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, which is this time, this whole month right now, where we are supposed to do an examination of sort of the gap between the people we have been and the people we're supposed to be. But it's all about this process of looking in the corners of ourselves that we don't want to look. And the whole idea with the shofar is that the blowing of it is like supposed to crack open the calcification.
Now, don't you, during your 10-day festival there, your 10-day, you guys focus, is it teshuva? Is that the word? Shuva, the idea of repentance, and you should be searching your hearts
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So along those lines,
where do you... Good Hebrew there, Jim. I'm impressed.
A little bit. So when you think about the law, the Torah, where does it speak to you during these times? What do you see in the Jewish scriptures that speak to you or give you courage, perspective, etc., in the midst of these times we're living in?
This is, I keep holding on to it. This is a text you and I have studied and looked at many times before. But in the Torah, in the 5 books, there's no commandment that is repeated nearly as much as this variation on the idea that you shall not oppress because you were oppressed, right? The sort of full version of it is usually you shall not oppress the stranger, the widow, or the orphan, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. But the fundamental idea here is that history obligates us. And I think it's such a powerful concept, right? Because so often we act like the awful things that have happened to us should give us in some way special obligations. And I actually, by the way, I think the rest of the world should act like that. When awful things happen to someone else, I think it should obligate us to them. But I think when awful things happen to us, the ethical response is to work for a world that they don't happen for anyone else. And I think that is the moral logic that is underneath this idea that you shall not oppress for you were oppressed. Right? This is not like so many other of the commandments in the Torah where it's you shall not do this because Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God. This is just you shall not do it because this is the way the world should be.
Yeah. So, and you, like you said, out of the fact that in those verses there, specifically in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, it's because you were oppressed, and you experienced how bad this is, you are to be sure you're not oppressing others. And yet we see, in the days of Jeremiah and the days of Isaiah, a lot of the prophets, they kept repeating the cycle of oppressing. And then that's often what's associated with the judgment that they face when the nation began to oppress other peoples.
Right? Like there's something so human about this cycle. I don't think it matters who you point to or what group of people you point to. I think you're going to find it there. There is something about humans that this is what we do. When we come together in groups, we find a reason to sort of pick out a minority of some sort and treat them differently.
As we're saying that, though, the problem is that many people, their mind going to say, well, that's not me. Because most people I know are not actively trying to oppress. They're not actively trying to marginalize. They're not actively fighting against people of color. And so because of that, they think, well, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, because we associate racism and prejudice only with hatred or these extreme actions. But I think that racism or prejudice can also be, sometimes we have judgments. We have judgments about people. We have assumptions, and we sort of lump everyone together. And so if we have beliefs about blacks and welfare, we sort of project that on the whole. If we have certain assumptions about Jews, we project that on the whole. And sometimes it's not overt, it's more subtle things. I think the fear of the black male, and there's been all kinds of research and studies done about if a black person walks into a store compared to a white person. A black person is walking through a parking lot, people lock their doors more often, all these different things. These are examples of things where we may not be overtly, intentionally trying to marginalize people, but we're acting upon assumptions that are more subtle. Can you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I totally believe we spend way too much time thinking about racists or anti-Semites, and not nearly enough time thinking about racism. Meaning it's the soup that we swim in. I'm doing this. This is a house that my grandfather built for himself, that my dad grew up in, that I grew up in, that is now my house, right? This is literally the example of generational wealth being passed on, and being passed on because why? Because my grandpa got the GI Bill, and because my grandpa got subsidized housing, right? That's fundamentally what sort of the boom of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was all about. Is it's subsidized housing, and these were things that were accessible to him and to my family that I inherit and have nothing to do with. That just black folks my age, their grandparents didn't have access to, and I keep thinking about the Jubilee, this amazing concept that you have in the Torah that says that every 50th year, right after a series, 7 cycles of 7, right? That every 50th year, there's this recognition that what happens over time is that wealth and power accumulate in places, right? And it's not for bad reasons. My grandpa wasn't a bad person, right? I feel very lucky. But that every 50 years, we have to acknowledge that the playing field has become unfair, just unjust. And so the whole system gets reset. And that's the whole idea of Jubilee, that all of it goes back, that the folks who have had to sell their ancestral properties because they couldn't, pay their rent, their families get it back. So that everyone gets another fair shot. And I think it's a concept that we have to hold on to, that I think we need a Jubilee. We need, in some ways, a racial reckoning Jubilee in this country.
That's a powerful, powerful analogy. And as you say that, here's where my mind goes. The theory of what you're saying, I can read the scriptures and I can say, oh, that's awesome. I can agree with you. But when you say that, it produces a bit of fear because well, how's that going to affect me? And my security and my wealth. But I work to earn some of this stuff, and I think that's where we get into these things, is that theoretically, when we talk about race and equality and we talk about these kind of policy things, we're all very self-protective by nature. It's part of how we're wired. But
I want to keep my house. Let's be clear about this, right?
That's right.
And I'd like for my grandkids to have this house.
Right. But the principle of saying there is a reset, and I love the idea that says that over time things do become imbalanced. And I was reading a book on I can't remember the title of it. It was about Jones County, Mississippi, which was a Confederate county in the middle of Mississippi during the Civil War that basically supported the Union. And is a very powerful story about this group of people that rebelled against the Confederacy in the heart of Mississippi. But in the midst of all that, one of the things it talks about the land lotteries of the 1800s, where basically the government comes in, they take land from the Native Americans, they basically take the land, they give them pennies on the dollar, they ship them out to other places, and then they have land lotteries. But here's the thing. If you were a Native American, you couldn't put your name in the hat. If you were a woman, you couldn't put your name in the hat. If you were a free slave, you could not put your name in the hat. Only white males could put their name in the hat. And so, it's easy to look back and say, well, that's not a big deal, whatever. But families that inherit that land for free and the other people who do not have a chance, it's such a leg up that that I just read that story and it blew me away. It was the first time I realized that there are certain elements of opportunity and privilege that we just take for granted that we don't see, because that's not me and my family. But as you said, subsidized housing, there's small things that have helped previous generations step up that other people have not had.
By the way, the ancient rabbis are pretty convinced that the Jubilee never got put into practice for exactly the reasons you're talking about. That even in this like idealized ancient world of the temple that they're imagining, even there, they couldn't quite imagine what it would take to create that kind of world. Right, I saw this meme that went around that was something like, sometimes to the privileged, equality feels like, I forget, it was more clever than saying a loss, but right. But it's true. Like the meme was there as like a critique, like, oh, these privileged people, you know what? But it's also, I think, just an emotional reality that you're talking about there, that it is a loss. That if we're talking about a world where it used to be that being a CEO was a spin that came up for white males, 95% of the time, and now it's not, hopefully now it's not, that's a loss. That's a real loss. And that comes with grief. And right, just because it was unfair doesn't mean that the grief isn't there too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, boy, I tell you, yeah, the whole idea of privilege is something, it's that I'm wrestling with and, been doing some read on as well, because like I said, we become very defensive because our mentality of privilege is that, well, it's been handed to us, been this and that. And that's not it. That's not really what I wish that whoever coined the term and I would have used a different word, because I think it's sort of a trigger word that causes people extreme defensiveness. So as you think about this, as we listen to stories, and I think everybody has different.
Hold on, I have a question. Isn't privilege just grace? Isn't it the things you have that you don't deserve? I don't mean don't deserve like you don't deserve that, but I mean like you just don't deserve them. You don't have it because of you being a great person. You have it because that's, grace.
That's really a good. I'd never thought about that. I mean, I think the definition that's really helped me is that it's not that you've been given so much stuff as much as it is that you're recognizing other people have challenges that you don't, like, and so, but yes, I think grace, let me wrestle with that, because that's really a good concept to say that you're giving opportunities. You've been, you have certain things, you don't have certain obstacles that other people do have. And that's an interesting concept to wrestle with.
Develop a strong, real friendship with a person of color. I don't think humans, I just don't think we're very good at having empathy for groups. I think we can be pretty good at having empathy for each other when it's a real relationship. And to me, a real relationship is a relationship where you eat at each other's homes. I mean, I guess maybe not right now, but in a non-COVID era, right? Like where there is that level of intimacy that exists, where you can be real, where you care about these people. Because I think in the end, all we're really talking about with any of this is, right, being able to place yourself into their situation and to recognize that our perspective is not the only perspective, and that my truth is, right, like my image of the way that America is not the only image of America. And I think that can only happen in relationship. I don't think it can happen online in the same way. I mean, maybe Zoom online, face-to-face online, but this doesn't happen in a Facebook conversation. I don't think anyone is convinced to become an anti-racist advocate from that great article that you made them read on a Facebook post, or right, like none of that right? That just triggers our own defensiveness and our own. So I guess it's look, this is the lesson I have from you, is that fundamentally it's about relationship. Because I certainly, look, as a minority in America, let me tell you, there are moments when I have less than generous feelings towards white evangelicals in this country. And then I think about you. And all of a sudden I can think through this differently, and I can relate differently, and I can, I think that's important.
As you're saying that, I think about the quote, and it's, I was, sometime back, I was going to post this on my Facebook, and I didn't, because I'm like, it could be so easily misconstrued. But, it's the Stalin quote, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And I think that when you talk about this, you see these things, and we see these stories, and we see protests, and we see stuff, and it's easy to become so callous to that and defensive about that. And once again, those things can represent fringes, but when I have a relationship and I'm able to hear. And one thing I'd like to speak into a little bit is, even as we say this, even inside the Jewish community, you touched on this earlier where you said a few years ago you were giving sermons about we need to stop talking about anti-Semitism. Now, now you're living it more consistently. Inside the Jewish community, these same debates are taking place within Jewish communities about privilege, about wealth, about minorities. Can you speak into some of the internal conflict that you're seeing and dialogue you're seeing inside the Jewish communities on these very same issues?
Oh, sure. Look, Jewish communities are absolutely divided in the same way as every other community. I think Jews in the United States often tend to be maybe sort of politically more aligned with the left, though pretty consistently, I should say, center left. There's not historically been a lot of, well, I don't know if that's true. There definitely have been some Jewish radicals here, but Jews are sort of cautiously liberal in the United States as a general rule. And I think it comes out of a general sense of fear that when we start talking about us and them, that it doesn't take long until Jews are no longer us. Right? I think that was the experience of Ashkenazi Jews, of white Jews in the United States, is that we came here and discovered if our Judaism could become entirely religious rather than ethnic, rather than national, rather than whatever it was, that we could be white and we could be welcome in a way that we couldn't otherwise. So all of which is to say that the current sort of waves of protest in the Black Lives Matter movement are sort of ripping at Jewish communities in the same way, where there are particularly more sort of traditional leaning or more conservative Jewish communities, or more white Jewish communities that are scared. And they're really scared and say now is the time to protect ourselves and to protect our own privilege and not to be in the streets or advocating for other folks. Yeah, look, the other piece that is real is Jews in the United States, really Jews anywhere, aren't safe in almost any coalition. Almost all of the anti-Semitism that I experience tends to be from right-wing extremists, except if I go to a protest. And let me tell you, if I show up at a progressive protest, I will encounter more than likely anti-Semitism there. It's real everywhere. It's almost impossible to be in a coalition without it. I walk into a church and I encounter anti-Semitism. I walk into a mosque and encounter anti-Semitism. I think I gave you a rambly answer here, but yeah.
No, but I appreciate that. And the reason I asked you that question, I wanted you to speak on, is this, because I think once again, this is one of the things where we tend to sort of group everyone together. So in even this interview, the temptation for some people are going to say, oh, well, I heard this rabbi say this, so you're speaking for all Jews in America.
And I'm speaking for all Jews in America.
Exactly right. And I think though, but that is how I think we view different ethnic groups, whether it's, like I said, whether it's Jews, whether it's Black Americans, whether it's people from the Middle East. And we tend to sort of we have assumptions. So a lot of evangelicals, we always think that, well, all Jews think that we're their friends, and they're happy because we support Israel and we're very big advocates of Israel. And so, so we lump all Jews together as sort of this monolithic group that all thinks and acts the same, but it's not the case. You have the same debates, discussions, differences, tensions, friction inside of your own synagogue and your larger Jewish community than we see, in a macro sense in America.
I'll never forget, this person, but when we were in Peoria, I taught at Ali, the retirement learning classes, and it was big in Peoria. And I taught there for 5 years and had the same coordinator for all 5 years. And after my very last class that I taught, and had all sorts of people come up who had I'd been learning with for the last 5 years, and thank you, we're going to miss you, so on and so forth, right before I was moving. My coordinator, this person, comes up to me and looks at me and says, I really am quite disappointed in who I discovered American Jews really are. And I've never quite forgotten that I think there's a real truth there, right? The reality is American Jews are not the same folks that evangelical Christians read about in the Bible. And we're not the same folks that Muslims read about in their Quran or hear about on their Friday sermons. And that's real too, right? Like,
Yeah, right.
we're not just stories. We don't just exist as stories in other people's myths.
One of the phrases you taught me is you would use this phrase a lot. You talk about imagined realities, that we have these sort of imagined pictures of different people and groups of people, and and then they become a reality to us. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this series is I'm just sharing the fact that I've called this humanizing race, because I think we have to see people. We have to see people, see stories, as opposed to go to the generalities. Because, we see those generalities in the Bible. You think about when Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he had a Cushite wife, and you see what were the two tribes, and I think it was in Joshua or Judges, where they had a little battle and they came back and they asked him a certain word before they could cross over, and if they didn't say the right word, Jiboleth, they couldn't say the right word, they killed him on the spot.
I don't know what it says that I know that from the West Wing episode more than I know it from the Bible, but there you go.
That's fun. But we've, it's just part of our nature. We've always sort of fallen into these things of judging people in categories as opposed to seeing them as individuals. And one of the things I love about you and Karen, and I know you feel the same about Stephanie and I, is that, we're individuals, and because of that, we're better. And I hope other people can hear our time today, Daniel, and they can be encouraged to reach out to somebody different than them and have conversations.
I just want to say, I think anyone who's met Stephanie would agree that she's an individual.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Anything else you want to say in closing, Daniel?
I guess I just want to look back and say, like, you talked about this, or we talked about the idea of these personal connections being the road to really having profound personal change. And I think it says something when you look at the folks that you're having on for this series, folks that have changed you and how you see the world, and who you've changed them and how they see the world. All the folks you're having on are personal relationships, right? I think that's the lesson more than anything, is that's what's important, and that's how we bring real change.
Perfect. Well, as we close, can you give us some sort of a Hebrew blessing as we close here?
Yeah. So maybe we'll go with a shared blessing from our communities, from Numbers, one of the oldest blessings that we have. They've actually found it inscribed on a silver scroll in Jerusalem. I don't know, 3,000 years old. A tiny little silver scroll that's been rolled up as like a medallion that people would wear, I guess. Wow. At the priestly blessing, the priestly benediction. It's traditionally you hold your hands up. Actually, the whole Spock thing comes from this, right? So we say, Yivirechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless us and keep us safe. Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May the light of the Holy One shine on us and be graceful to us. There's our word. Yisadonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. And most of all, wherever we go in our lives, in our relationships, may they be places of peace.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's so great to talk to you. Thank you for sharing today.
Such a treat.